Rain fell softly over the noisy streets of New York, washing the sidewalks in a cold gray shimmer. People rushed by under umbrellas, the smell of hot food drifting through the air from food carts and diners. The city pulsed with energy, but in the middle of all that movement, a single German shepherd sat completely still. He was soaked, his paws trembling slightly from the cold, but he didn't bark or whine. He just stared through the window of a brightly lit butcher shop, his eyes locked on the fresh cuts of meat hanging behind the glass. Most people walked right past him. A few gave him a quick glance, maybe a second of pity, then hurried along. To them, he looked like just another stray, a sad but forgettable part of the city's background noise. But this dog was different. His ribs pressed against his skin, and his once thick coat was dirty and matted, with patches of fur missing and old scars showing beneath. Even so, there was something about the way he sat that made him stand out. He didn't skulk around like the other stray dogs that darted through alleyways or barked at trash cans. He didn't sniff the ground or beg anyone for food. Instead, he sat upright, alert but calm, as if waiting for something more than scraps. His eyes didn't plead, they searched. It wasn't desperation in his gaze, there was patience, something learned, something practiced. You could feel it just looking at him. This dog had known a different life once, a life where he mattered. Despite his miserable state, there was a quiet strength in him that was impossible to ignore. He held his head high, his ears perked, even though he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. The cold wind blew through the streets, making him shiver, but he didn't move from his spot. And he didn't steal, even with the scent of raw meat hanging in the air. There was a strange dignity in his hunger, as if his body was starving, but his soul refused to break. People came and went, not realizing what they were passing by. He wasn't just another lost animal, he was waiting, as if hoping someone might finally see him, really see him, but no one did, no one stopped. And so, he stayed where he was, quiet and still, a lone figure in the rain, holding on to whatever piece of himself he could. His name was Maverick, and he hadn't always been just another stray lost in the chaos of the city. There was a time when he had purpose, when people looked at him with pride, not pity. He was a 9 officer, trained from a young age to serve, protect, and obey. He had chased down criminals in dark alleys, sniffed out hidden dangers, and stood between his handler and threats without hesitation. Every move he made used to be guided by commands, by duty, by a bond forged in trust and loyalty. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner. For years, Maverick wore his badge in the form of discipline, strength, and quiet courage. But all of that changed the day he was injured in the line of duty. A deep wound to his hind leg left him limping, and in the world of law enforcement, speed and strength are non-negotiable. He was deemed unfit for service. At first, his handler tried to fight the system, as many officers do when it's time for their 9 partners to retire. Most of them adopt their dogs, bring them home, and give them a life of comfort after years of loyal service. Maverick should have had that too, but something went wrong. Somewhere in the mountain of paperwork and transfers, his case slipped through the cracks. Instead of ending up in a good home, he was sent to a crowded shelter with the promise of being placed with a loving family. That promise was never kept. The system failed him in a way that no animal, especially not one who had served, should ever experience. Eventually, he was handed off to someone who didn't understand what he was or what he'd been through. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was just a damaged dog, a burden. It didn't take long for that new owner to give up on him. One day, without warning, Maverick was dumped on the street like yesterday's trash. No collar, no food, no explanation. Just gone. Left to figure out the world on his own. And yet, even as he wandered the city, starving and injured, the discipline never left him. His instincts were still shaped by years of training. He didn't beg, didn't scavenge, didn't fight for scraps like other strays. He sat, he waited, he observed. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed someone might come back for him. That belief faded slowly with every cold night, every door slammed in his face, every person who looked past him without seeing the soldier he once was. Maverick didn't know how to be anything else, and without commands to follow or a mission to complete, he became stuck between 2 worlds, the one where he was valued and the one where he had been forgotten. The soft chime of the butcher shop door cut through the rainy silence like a whisper. A tall man with a graying beard and sharp weathered eyes stepped out, a heavy bag of fresh cuts hanging from one hand. He stopped in his tracks the moment he saw Maverick sitting there soaked still and silent. For a second, the man just stared, eyebrows knitting together as he studied the dog. Something about him was off. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that didn't fit. The way the dog sat, how his back was straight and his gaze was locked, unwavering, it wasn't how a normal stray acted. Most street dogs flinched at movement or slunk around in fear. But this one, he looked like he was waiting. The butcher didn't move right away. He just stood there frowning as if trying to place a distant memory that hovered just out of reach. Slowly he knelt, careful not to startle the dog, and set the bag down beside him. He extended a rough, calloused hand toward Maverick, who didn't back away, didn't growl, didn't even blink. His ears twitched slightly, alert to the gesture, but his body held steady, tensed not in fear, but readiness, like he was expecting a command, not a threat. The butcher tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You're not just any stray, are you?" he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Maverick didn't respond, of course, but there was a flicker, just a faint shift in his eyes, like a spark trying to reignite. That tiny reaction was enough. The scars along the dog's legs, the quiet control in his stillness, the way he didn't snatch the meat being offered at all pointed to one thing: training, discipline. This wasn't a dog who had survived by instinct alone. This was a dog who had once followed orders, who had lived for them. Reaching back into the bag, the butcher pulled out a tender cut of beef and held it out. "Here," he said softly. "Eat." Maverick hesitated. His eyes flicked from the meat to the man's face, searching, unsure. It wasn't just hunger holding him back, it was disbelief. After being abandoned, starved, and ignored by so many, kindness felt suspicious. But the butcher didn't rush him. He didn't push or coax. He simply waited, hands steady. Finally, Maverick leaned forward and took the piece gently, as if afraid it might be taken away at the last second. The butcher watched him chew slowly, deliberately, never once breaking eye contact. He felt something stir in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. This dog had been someone's partner, someone's protector, and someone had let him go. As the rain continued to fall, quiet and steady, the butcher reached into the bag again and set another piece of beef down beside the first. "There's more," he said, his voice lower now. "Take your time." The rain didn't let up, but the air between them felt still. The butcher stood in the doorway, bag in hand, the warm light from inside casting a soft glow out onto the wet sidewalk. He didn't say anything else, didn't whistle or call the dog. Instead, he turned and stepped back into his shop, leaving the door half open behind him. It wasn't an invitation in the way most people would offer. It was quiet, subtle, and without pressure. For Maverick, that made it harder. He was used to commands, to structure, to knowing what came next. But now, with no leash, no handler, no voice guiding him, he had to decide for himself. The open door wasn't just a doorway, it was a choice. And choices were dangerous. Trust had only ever led to disappointment. Maverick stayed where he was for a while, his body still soaked, his paws chilled to the bone. He looked at the open shop, then back at the dark street behind him, the only world he'd known for months. The streets were cold, harsh but familiar. He understood how to survive out there, how to keep moving, stay alert, stay alive. But inside that shop, that was unknown territory. It smelled different, warm, like fresh meat and spice and something close to safety. But safety was a feeling he no longer trusted. His instincts screamed caution, warning him not to step forward. Yet something tugged at him, not hunger exactly, but something deeper, a tiredness he couldn't shake. A part of him wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep running anymore. Finally, with slow, careful steps, Maverick moved toward the door. He paused at the threshold, ears flicking, body tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. But nothing came, no trap, no harsh voice, just the soft hum of the butcher's workspace and the steady rhythm of a normal evening inside. He crossed the line, one cautious paw at a time, and stepped into the warmth. The butcher glanced over his shoulder but didn't speak, didn't stare. He just gave a small, simple nod and tossed a clean towel onto the floor near the dog. "Dry off," he muttered, before returning to his work. Maverick stood for a moment, unsure what to do. Then, without fully relaxing, he settled onto the towel. He didn't curl up. He didn't drop his guard. But for the first time in weeks, he was off his feet. No longer out in the cold. No longer waiting for the next blow. And as the door gently closed behind him, the street disappeared, and with it, a small part of the life he'd been forced to live. Inside the shop, the world felt different, slower, quieter. Maverick remained near the doorway, his soaked paws pressing against the worn wooden floor, unsure if he truly belonged. The air was thick with the scent of raw meat, spices, and something unfamiliar but strangely comforting warmth. Not just the temperature, but the feeling. It pressed in around him, unfamiliar and overwhelming. His body remained stiff, coiled in case he needed to flee. The hum of the refrigerators, the steady rhythm of the butcher's footsteps, the soft scrape of his knife across the cutting board, Maverick took it all in. To anyone else, these were normal background noises. But to Maverick, each sound had to be analyzed, cataloged, in case it signaled danger. Trust wasn't something he handed out anymore. Even here, even now, he was alert, not because he wanted to be, but because it had become who he was. The butcher said nothing. He didn't reach out, didn't praise Maverick for coming in, didn't try to pet him or throw him a bone like others had done before. He simply worked, letting the dog be. That quiet acceptance threw Maverick off more than any gesture might have. It wasn't a transaction. There was no expectation of obedience, no exchange of food for tricks. The towel on the floor wasn't a command. It was an offering, freely given. Still, it took everything in Maverick to allow himself to use it. Eventually, he lowered his body onto the towel with slow, cautious movements. He didn't curl up. He didn't fully relax, but he stayed. His eyes never stopped scanning. His ears twitched at every little sound, but for once, he wasn't bracing for the next moment of survival. For once, he was allowed to simply exist. Time passed in quiet rhythm. The butcher moved through his tasks with practiced ease, occasionally glancing at Maverick without judgment. There was no rush, no forced interaction, just shared space, and something unspoken that passed between them. Maverick remained on the towel, alert but no longer on edge, his breathing steadier than it had been in months. He hadn't realized just how tired he was, not just in his body, but in his soul. He had lived too long in survival mode, waiting for kindness to turn to cruelty. But here, there was no trick, no hidden agenda. Just a man going about his routine, and a dog trying to believe in something again. And as the shop lights dimmed, the soft glow from the street lamps outside casting long shadows on the walls, Maverick stayed where he was. No chain held him. No command kept him. And yet, for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel the urge to leave. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, in this moment, he wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to rest. The early morning light filtered softly through the butcher shop's front window, casting long, golden beams across the wooden floor. Maverick stirred, ears twitching as the comforting sense of raw meat and fresh coffee drifted through the still air. For the first time in months, he had slept through the night without fear. No cold concrete beneath him, no shadows to chase, no constant need to keep one eye open. His breathing was steady, deep. Slowly, he lifted his head, blinking against the light, and glanced across the room. The butcher stood at the counter, steaming mug in hand, watching him with a quiet sort of understanding. There was no smile, no big gesture, just a nod, an unspoken recognition that something had shifted between them. Maverick didn't move toward the door. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, measured step forward. The butcher let out a small huff, setting his coffee aside. "Morning, soldier," he said gruffly, the title slipping out naturally, as if it had always belonged to the dog, and in a way, it did. Maverick had no badge now, no partner, no uniform, but the discipline, the strength, the presence of service still lived in him. The butcher looked down at the dog, studying him again, not with pity, but with respect. "Let's get you fed properly," he added, nodding toward the back of the shop. "After that, well, I could use a good set of eyes around here." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a promise. It was something else, a chance. Maverick hesitated for only a moment, then followed. No leash, no force, just choice. The butcher didn't need a pet. Maverick didn't need a master. But somehow, in that quiet, worn-down shop, they had found something they both didn't know they were missing: purpose. Maverick's story isn't just about a dog left behind. It's about all the things we throw away when they no longer serve us: people, animals, even values. He was trained to protect, to serve without question, and when he could no longer perform, the world turned its back on him. But his worth didn't vanish with his injury. Just like many veterans, workers, or caregivers who are discarded after giving everything, Maverick was more than what he could do. He was someone who had been, and someone finally saw that. We live in a world that moves fast, that often forgets those who fall behind. But stories like Maverick's remind us to slow down, to look closer, and to ask ourselves what it really means to matter. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stop, to notice, to care without expecting anything in return. And sometimes, that small act of kindness can become the start of something much bigger for both the one who gives it and the one who finally receives it. The days that followed passed slowly, quietly, like the soft rhythm of a healing wound. Maverick remained cautious, always aware of his surroundings, never fully letting his guard down. Every time the bell above the butcher shop door jingled, his ears would perk and his body would tense, ready to assess the situation. He never barked, ever lunged, but the instinct to protect, to respond, stayed wired in his bones. Still, something was changing. Each morning, he greeted the butcher with a steady gaze, his tail giving the faintest twitch. It wasn't excitement, not yet, but it was something close. He began to eat more confidently, though never greedily. The butcher never pushed, never demanded. He simply continued his routines with quiet respect, allowing the dog to find his rhythm on his own. Little by little, Maverick started to move with more ease through the shop. He would follow the butcher's footsteps from counter to storage room, stopping to sniff the corners of his new territory. The cold, distant look in his eyes began to soften. He no longer paced or stared longingly at the exit. Some mornings, he would sit beside the door, watching the street with a calm presence, almost like he was on duty. The butcher noticed these things but didn't comment. He would simply glance at Maverick, offer a small nod, and keep going with his work. At night, when the shop closed, Maverick didn't wait by the door or curl up by the exit like he had the first few nights. Instead, he found a quiet corner near the butcher's workbench and settled in with less tension in his frame. He was still alert. He always would be, but there was trust forming in the silence between them. One morning, as the butcher unlocked the front door, Maverick stood up and walked to his side without hesitation. He didn't need to be called. He had chosen to be there. As the door swung open and the light from outside poured in, Maverick stepped forward not to leave, but to watch, to guard, to be present. It was as if he had decided that this was his post now, this little butcher shop, his mission. The butcher looked down at him and gave a quiet huff of amusement. "Figured you'd stick around," he muttered. There was no ceremony, no dramatic moment, just a shared understanding. Maverick had come a long way from the starving, rain-soaked dog who sat frozen on the sidewalk. He would likely never be the same as before. Some wounds don't fully heal, but he had found something worth protecting again. In a world that had once discarded him, he was finally choosing to belong. And maybe that's what healing really looks like, not forgetting the past, but finding the courage to stand in the present, one step at a time. In time, a quiet rhythm settled into the butcher shop. Two figures, one man and one dog, learning how to exist in each other's presence without needing to fill the silence. The butcher never forced conversation, but he began to talk more to himself, it seemed, but always with Maverick within earshot. Comments about the day's cuts, mutterings about late deliveries or rising prices. Maverick never answered, of course, but he always listened. He began to follow the butcher's movements, not closely like a pet, but steadily, like a partner keeping watch. When the man moved from the front counter to the fridge, Maverick would rise, stretch, and quietly reposition himself nearby. His loyalty, once commanded, now returned out of choice. Through a sunlit forest, a curious fox with a fluffy tail and bright, glimmering eyes darted between the trees, its tiny paws leaving soft imprints on the mossy ground. Pausing to sniff a patch of wildflowers, it tilted its head, listening to the distant chirp of a bird, as if the entire forest were a melody it alone could understand. The butcher noticed every small change. He saw how Maverick's tail twitched slightly when he entered the room, how the dog's eyes followed him with alert calm instead of suspicion. One morning, he found Maverick already sitting by the door, waiting for the shop to open like he understood the rhythm now and chose to be part of it. There was no leash, no collar, no formal arrangement. But there was something between them that didn't need to be spoken aloud. They began to move through the space with a kind of unspoken cooperation. When a customer entered, Maverick would stand, not aggressively, but present steady, like he was there for a reason. And customers noticed. Some asked about the dog, others just gave him a respectful nod. There was something noble about him, even now, especially now. The butcher never claimed Maverick as his dog. He didn't need to. Their bond wasn't built on ownership. It was built on shared space, shared quiet, and mutual recognition. The butcher didn't try to fix him. He didn't try to make him playful or affectionate. He just gave him what so few had before: respect. And Maverick responded not with tricks or obedience, but by staying. He could have walked out the open door any day, returned to the streets he knew so well, but he didn't. He chose to remain. In his own way, he was giving something back. He was watching over the shop, over the man who had offered him a second chance without asking for anything in return. The bond between them grew not because they needed each other, but because they recognized something in one another. A tired kind of strength, still standing, still willing to try again.